The struggle that I see is not so much the VP saying, I'm going to lose half my people, but the VP saying or thinking, I don't know how to lead my people in this new way. I don't know how to reward failure.
Welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. This week, we're going to change it up just a little bit. My son, Henry, is here, and he's going to do the intro for the show this week. Okay, Henry, ready, set, go.
This is episode 57 of the Schmidt List. Today, we're talking to Jeff Sussna, and we have to talk to him about the number one whole thing that trips up organizations and teams when it comes to adopting Agile principles and his concept of promise-driven design. Thank you for coming to the show. I can't like a wrecking ball.
Okay. Mr. Sussna, Jeff.
Hi.
Thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Oh, it's good to see you. So I wanted to hear a little bit about how did you get into consulting? You started Sussna & Associates, was it 7-8 years ago now?
8 years ago.
8 years ago. Yep. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
How did you get into consulting and doing the DevOps, design thinking, the Agile, and the speaking events? How did that all happen for you?
I've been in the software industry for 30 years, and my background is really broad. I've built systems. I've led organizations across the entire development, QA, and operations spectrum. Mm-hmm. I've worked for startups. I've worked for Silicon Valley technology companies. I've worked for enterprises. But it was about 10 years ago that I discovered two things simultaneously that really profoundly impacted my approach to my work.
Okay.
The first was design thinking, and in particular, service design. Mm-hmm. And the second was cloud computing. When I put those two things together...
Which not a lot of people do. I just want to point out. They seem very different.
Well, they seem very different. But when you think about it, if you look at modern approaches to IT is a service, infrastructure is a service, software is a service. What's the word that's in common? Service.
Right.
I was actually a liberal arts student in college. So the idea of design and design thinking didn't feel foreign to me. Mm-hmm. In fact, the reason I got into software in the first place was my advisor said, go take a class that has nothing to do with what you're doing. And I took an artificial intelligence programming class. And I went, ooh, I like this.
Yeah.
So I came into software through an unusual avenue, and I did well at it. I mean, I worked for Apple, I worked for Oracle, I did the .com thing in the late 90s in San Francisco, but I always felt like I had a slightly different approach that I couldn't put my thumb on. And then I read Tim Brown's book, Change by Design, and went, aha, this is me. I'm not a designer, but I am a design thinker. It's how I solve problems. So that led me to service design, and then I put that together with the cloud, which was happening right about then. Mm-hmm. And I realized, this is about service.
Yeah.
Also around that time, I was CTO for a software as a service startup. Mm-hmm. And to be perfectly honest, I got tired of having my cell phone by my bed at night and being on 24 hours a day. And I also felt like my skills were really in not being operational, but helping people improve how they're operational. Mm-hmm. So I'm really kind of a consultant by mentality, if you will. So I started my own practice here in the Twin Cities, 2010. And my focus is on bringing together Agile and DevOps with design thinking in a meaningful way. I'm focused on helping companies build teams that continuously learn both from their customers and from each other. Because we live in a world where really all you can do anymore is learn.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because in my experience, that's one of the things that I think is difficult in teams is where if their expectation is delivery, right? How do you start to change them to start thinking about it as a service, right? When it's like they've been told this is my job. My job is to deliver this thing. Is once I deliver this thing, I'm done, wrap it up, and I'm out the door, right? But how do you start coaching people around the service side of things? That could be a difficult conversation if they don't feel like that's part of their job, right?
Yes. And one of the things I've discovered is that a lot of it depends on where people are in the pain equation. What is their pain? And I've sort of learned as a consultant that if they don't have the right pain, they're not going to listen to my message. And if they do have the right pain, they are going to listen to my message. And so it's finding people with the right pain and also understanding what their pain is and crafting my message to that. More and more, I encounter organizations, software service organizations in particular, whether they're startups or enterprises, where they're doing okay on the product level.
Okay.
They're able to sort of spit stuff out.
Delivery's fine.
Delivery's okay.
Things are being delivered.
The organizations where delivery's really good, they don't hire me.
Okay.
But there are companies that hire me where delivery is reasonably okay. And they're starting to figure out that the things around it are the problem. Like, we're delivering this stuff and our customers can't consume it. Why can't they consume it? Because we're not set up to help them consume it. We're not set up to help them with problems when they do consume it. So all of that stuff about the customer journey starts to become visible. Kind of, if you remove the delivery constraint, you discover the next one, which is the support and service constraint. For example, I've worked with a number of startups where they focus very intensely on their features, and then they discover that onboarding is a nightmare. Well, guess what? Onboarding is the first thing that happens. If onboarding is a nightmare, there's a reasonable chance that your new customer is going to go away and not be your customer anymore. So there's sort of a lot of, again, if you take sort of theory of constraints kind of stuff, well, we got rid of this constraint. Where's the next one? And so there's a journey of discovering service level constraint.
It's difficult to do it out of the gate, do it great, right? I mean, it's especially because you're building a team. You can follow all the rules. You can do it just like everybody else has done it. There's books out there. There's playbooks all over the place. Just give me an email address. I can download a playbook, and it'll tell me how to structure my team and become agile and continuous delivery and all those things, right? But if I'm not building that team in a way that allows them to be focused on having ownership and being autonomous, right, that can be a disaster.
Yes. And I think from my perspective, the biggest obstacle to building the team is there's kind of this irony, which is we talk about Agile, we talk about DevOps, and both of them are very much about breaking things down into smaller pieces. And then we don't break the task of adopting Agile or DevOps or Scrum or continuous delivery or what have you into smaller pieces.
No, it's like a big wave that just washes over you, right?
And we don't think about it as a process of continuous learning itself. We think that we're going to kind of forklift it in, which again is very ironic because we tell people, well, you can't just take your IT and forklift it to the cloud. You have to re-engineer it. But we don't tell them, well, you also have to do re-engineering as part of adopting Agile and DevOps. And I see very, very little out there about how to do that, or even that you need to do that.
But again, I think it comes from this kind of industrial age sort of thinking of like, well, if this is a framework, I just install the framework and act as if, right?
Yes. Absolutely.
Because if I just build a new assembly line and just flip the switch, then everything just starts working that way, right?
Right. So it sounds like you've read my book, which starts out by talking about industrialism versus post-industrialism, and pretty much all of the talks that I give start with, well, how do you do Agile right? How do you do DevOps right? You have to start by understanding what it is we're actually trying to accomplish. And what it is we're trying to accomplish is to deal with the fact that we actually are living in a different world. We spent 250 years learning how to design, build, deliver products at scale, how to broadcast messages to 2.5 billion people at a time. That world is actually gone. The message about Oreo cookies or Walgreens or whatever is happening on Twitter. It's not happening on the Super Bowl.
Right.
And the dynamics of it are very, very different. And the dynamics of what it means to be in business are very, very different. And if we think that Agile or DevOps or design thinking or whatever you have are about doing the same thing faster, it's not.
Right. Yeah, because I mean that's the sort of story that a lot of executives get fed, which is I can have it faster and cheaper using these by breaking things down into smaller tasks, right?
Yes, it's really interesting. I was having a conversation just the other day that the guy who invented Scrum wrote a book called How to Do Twice the Work in Half the Time. Now, I haven't read the book yet. I bought it. I skimmed it, and everything I saw that he said made perfect sense. And I found myself thinking, oh, did he do us all a disservice just with the title of his book? Because what his book is really about is how to deliver twice the useful work in half the time by cutting out waste and misunderstanding. And it's like, oh, this is fantastic stuff. But even that has this shift from thinking about output, right? How many pieces of pig iron have you moved across the factory floor? To use the Frederick Winslow Taylor model of thinking about things, to how much value, how much benefit, and even that is different.
Yeah.
So in a sense, we're asking everybody to do really different things in really different ways.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because this is where I find it fascinating, because I had always assumed, especially when I was younger, was that if you knew what the rules were and you knew that 1 + 1 = 2, like this is just going to work this way. But then when it hits people, that's when it gets weird and turns political and gets odd. Because I really like everything you're saying, Jeff. The problem that I have, though, is that when you come in with these frameworks, or you're talking about DevOps or these other things, where I see people struggling with is like, who owns this now? Who's in charge? Who makes the decisions? If we're going to change these things, because a lot of, like you were mentioning, I think a lot of it comes down to like there's some org change that happens with some of these larger changes, right? And that's scary.
In my experience, that's not the main issue that I encounter. You and I were chatting before we started this about that. And in my mind, I was thinking, well, I don't really know what to say about that, because that's not what I see. I do see certain amounts of things at the lower levels of workers being worried about losing their jobs, right? Particularly DevOps. Well, we can manage 2,000 servers with 2 people instead of 20 people. You're all going to lose your job. Right. But in terms of the larger org, I don't see that. And the interesting thing is, to be honest, DevOps actually tells a little bit of a lie.
Okay. Because
it says, oh, we're going to get rid of the silos. The truth is you can't actually get rid of silos. You can only move them around. Right. That, somebody still needs to make sure that the network works. And you can't just distribute that to 1,000 little 2 pizza teams. Yeah. So there's still work to be done by more or less the same people who have to do it. The question is, how do you do the work? And the struggle that I see is not so much the VP saying, I'm going to lose half my people, but the VP saying or thinking, I don't know how to lead my people in this new way.
Because it is different.
Because it is different. I don't know how to reward failure, for example.
Right.
That scares the bejesus out of me.
Right, because that's difficult, right? Because people say that, I see it over and over again. People will get and read Lean Startup in a company, and they'll be like, okay, this all sounds good except for that whole learning part where we admit to our mistakes and we celebrate them and we promote them in a way.
Right.
Because our business has been around 100 years. We don't
make mistakes.
We don't make mistakes,
right?
Let alone go and tell other people about
exactly.
But again, like in the startup world, it can almost be celebrated sometimes, like a badge of honor,
right?
Almost, right?
Yes, yes.
And that's when because the word pivot has a positive sort of spin to it, right? Is like. No, we make tires now or something like that.
And we write a blog post about how now we make tires instead of making paper clips.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
But you can't do that if you're at General Motors or something. That would seem hard.
Well, yes. And one of the other things that I do, and I like to joke, and maybe I should stop joking about it and actually do it. I like to joke that I should offer a fixed fee consulting practice where all I do is I walk around your organization and I say the same sentence over and over and over again, which is make your work smaller. Really what Agile and DevOps are about is not going faster. It's about going smaller, delivering much smaller increments, right? How do you take a one-line bug fix from the point where it's identified to the point where the fix is in production as efficiently as possible? And so it's not actually a matter of, okay, now you're going to incent all of your people to fail. We can, if you want to, we can talk about that whole rat's nest of celebrating failure and what it really means. But anyway, is do one experiment, one little experiment, and see how it feels. And if it feels okay, do a bigger experiment and see how that feels. Again, a lot of what my work is about with my clients is showing them of, let's try this little thing and see how it feels. And, oh, that felt pretty good. Let's try it again. Or that didn't feel good. Let's understand why it didn't feel good and do something different. So again, I think part of the industrial mindset is we think we have to work in these really big chunks, right? Yeah. We either do Agile or we don't do Agile. It's like, no, don't do Agile. Do this one little tiny thing over here and understand something about it.
Right.
And part of that is that if you fail in really, really small pieces, it's really safe. For example, if you're going to take $100 and tell one of your people to go off for 45 minutes and try something, and they come back and say, that was a terrible idea, we should never do it again, you don't have to tell your boss that you wasted $100.
Right.
You only have to tell your boss if you wasted $10,000. So some of it is about creating safety to learn how to learn.
I think it's also up to leadership, though, to create those safe spaces. Like, they have to be deliberate about it, to say, like, if I did walk in and you were spending $100 on a weird experiment, that's okay. Because that's part of the experiment. Like that's why you have a job.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. And so as you scale that, though, and again, I know we're jumping around a bit, but in these larger organizations, when they're trying to break their work down smaller, where I find some of the challenges is just in the overall supply chain not supporting them being able to do it in their silo or in that group, because the supporting characters around them, accounting and procurement and all these different things, don't work that way. They have an annual budget and that's what you get, So I have two answers for that. Okay.
The one is that what I see is that as certain parts of the organization start to work more effectively in new ways, they put pressure on people like procurement to work more effectively in new ways as well. The second is there's a really interesting dynamic when you start talking about money and budgets. And one of the things I hear is, well, you can't do Agile with annual budgets. I don't believe that. If you're a startup and you go to a VC, they don't give you money every day.
Right.
They say, here's $3 million. Come back in 8 months, and if you're doing okay, we'll give you another $3 million. The key is that the $3 million is predicated on a set of outcomes.
Yes.
Right? If you can get 100 customers, or if you can start to make a profit, or if you can build a reasonable version 1, we'll give you more money. What they don't do is say, oh, and you have to hire these 3 people and pay them this amount of money, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And I actually think there's no problem with annual budgets if the notion is your responsibility is to spend this money effectively, right? Here's $3 million. Do something that will give us $3.5 million when it comes out the other side, or what have you. And if you want to do that with 3 people or 9 people or 7 people or this tool or that tool, that's okay. As long, I think that governing constraints, whether it be funding or compliance or security or what have you, are perfectly fine. Almost every organization I go into, one of their root problems is their things are too big. Their stories are a sprint long.
Oh, yeah.
The reason their stories are a sprint long is not the fault of the ceremony. I think there's just a missing piece in people's understanding about how to solve problems that Agile is actually pointing at, but it never quite says it.
Okay. Kind of gesturing. It's kind of nodding.
So I try and just be really explicit about it.
So when you come into some of these groups, and you're charged with helping them do that exact thing, which is breaking down the smaller tasks. What are some of the challenges that you normally run up against?
I think people don't know how to break work down. I'll give you a perfect example working with a storage team, because I do a lot of work on Agile for infrastructure organizations. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we did, which I often do as a forcing function, is to say, okay, new rule. You're not allowed to have a user story that's longer than 2 days worth of work. If it is, you have to break it down. Mm. So storage engineer says, well, my story is we're moving to a new backup system. So I have to go to 200 servers and I have to shut off the old backup software and install and configure the new backup software. I can't break that down. It's just one task. And I said, what are you going to do today? He said, well, I'm going to do the first 10 servers. I said, boom, done. What are you going to do tomorrow? I'm going to do the next 10 servers. Boom, done. Why is that useful? Because tomorrow morning he can come in and he can either say, well, I finished the first 10 servers, in which case everybody knows, well, we're 5% of the way through. Mm-hmm. Good for us. Or I only got 5 done and here's why. And then you can either say, okay, let's fix that so we can get back to doing 10 servers a day. Or, well, now we realize we really only can do 5 servers a day. It's going to take us twice as long. We need to change our plans. Yeah. So you can plan and understand your work a lot better simply because you've broken it down. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just that it's really hard for people to think that way. Yeah. I guess we haven't been taught how to do it.
Yeah, well, and I think it comes from a lot of different aspects too, especially if you've been in a place for a long time, right? I get the thing that where people are saying this is how we always have done it. It's always this large task to like scrub this information or pull this data set. Right. There's also having somebody come in and say it's okay to do it differently is important too, right?
Yeah.
Like I was saying earlier about creating that space that says it's okay to do it and being deliberate about it.
Yeah, and I would also say that, again, the value of breaking it down into smaller pieces when you're learning how to do something new is part of it is they have to see it. Mm-hmm. You know, I can say, well, make your work smaller and life will be good. But until they start doing it and going, oh, right. Actually, life is better.
Right. They have to feel it.
Yes, they do have to feel it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's almost like developing muscle memory. Kind of thing.
Yeah, and because change is scary, right? Like I was mentioning earlier, people, especially in different organizations that maybe have more of a layoff culture, any kind of change can be scary. Mm-hmm. I think, like you're saying, I think that's also a benefit of getting around that is if you're breaking the change up into smaller pieces, you can also help your team understand that. It's not a death sentence.
Right.
This is about actually growing. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. So I like that how you put that because I think a lot of people, when they talk about change, they talk about these grand visions and it's this big 5-10 year effort and whichever. Right. And here I am, I'm part of this group and I'm like, how do I impact this, right?
And well, that's really interesting on when you said these sort of big grand 5 to 10 year plans kind of thing. It made me think of there's a certain tension happening, which I think is a healthy tension between the design and Agile worlds. Mm-hmm. And to some degree, I think it comes down to a misunderstanding, which is really Agile's fault. But there's the idea that we need to do design in an Agile way. We need to do design sprints, which means we have 2 weeks to design anything. Mm-hmm. And you can't always design something in 2 weeks. You can always only design really, really small things, which means we can never do any really meaningful innovation. Mm-hmm. And I think there are some things we can resolve on sort of a tactical level that can fix that. Mm-hmm. But to me, the more interesting discussion is, well, in this new world that we live in, where things are changing more and more continuously, what makes you think you can actually come up with a big, long design and get it right? Mm. And if you look at Facebook, if you look at Twitter, and if you look at the massive levels of unintended consequences, hopefully it would be an opportunity for humility on the part of the design community. There was an interesting comment by Johnny Ive of Apple where he said anytime you release a product, you're actually releasing two products, the one you intended to and the one you didn't intend to. And you can look at the iPhone, and the wonderful things and the horrible things that have happened to society because of the iPhone.
Yeah.
And the designers probably couldn't have figured out in advance that they were going to be enabling a culture of narcissism by releasing the iPhone. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the whole point.
Yeah.
And I think the point to me where Agile and DevOps and design thinking come together in a meaningful way is it gives you a mechanism for seeing your unintended consequences more continuously. One of the really great things about DevOps, when you get beyond this sort of DevOps as fast release management and you start looking at resilience engineering and chaos engineering and things like that, the basic notion is that your operating environment is a complex system. You can't predict it. You can't control it. Failure is going to happen. Mm-hmm. You're going to have security breaches. You're going to have outages. You're going to have failures. Let's actually approach things with that assumption instead of trying to design and engineer failure out of existence. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a tremendous amount that the design community could learn from that. Of let's not assume we did our user testing great. We did our prototyping great. We did our A/B testing great. Let's not assume that we're done. Now that we've released it. That really it's just the beginning, and it's going to tell us things that we weren't expecting, just like user testing tells us things we weren't expecting.
Yeah, I think that's where sometimes I've seen people struggle. I have two comments here. One is that because there's somebody higher up, though, that wants this thing to be done. Somebody who's paying the bills are like, when is it going to be done? And you can go to them and say, well, this is never going to be done. It's custom software or whatever case may be. It's our infrastructure. There's always going to be, but they want to be able to put a price tag on something and say, that cost me that. Now I can move on. Because in any other areas of their business, that's how it works, right? Is that this warehouse cost this much. And I bought the warehouse. We're done.
Right. There is a conflict, particularly happening in enterprises, between traditional management, program management, project management, where we have a project. We're going to roll out this new backup software, or we're going to deliver this new web application, and it's going to cost us $800,000 and 15 people and take 9 months, and then we'll be done. I think the pressure that as companies get more into the digital side of things, and they start tipping up websites, and they discover that the development on the website is never done, there's pressure on that. And I see, and we can come back to funding, I see organizations struggling with, okay, we get project funding when we really need product funding. One of the things that I've told some people, sort of in lieu of fixing their organization, is to game the system. Is basically fine. Every year you go ask for a new project, and under the covers, that project is do another year of work on our product.
Right. Right. Just hack the system however you can, right?
Yeah.
I think that's super smart. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that you also recently wrote about the differences, and maybe it might sound like just nomenclature, but I don't think it is, because I think you're onto something about the difference between talking about users versus humans, right? And how, and I think it goes back to what you were saying about that Johnny Ive quote about, right, you're delivering two products. There's what you think the user will use, but then there's the human aspect of this secondary sort of world that this thing lives in.
We can talk about that on a philosophical level, which is that people are more than just what they do with our products. And I think that's important. I think we can also talk about it on a more mundane level. Is one of the things that service starts to introduce. And when we talk about this whole industrial, post-industrial thing, part of it is this shift from product to service and needing to think about what we make differently, is that people use services to get something larger done. And if we don't think about the larger context, we miss things. So, for example, why is it that people complain about slow or expensive Wi-Fi in hotels? Because you don't just use a hotel to sleep. Airbnb had the most, I saw a talk on service design by someone from Airbnb, and she said the most amazing thing. She said, when we were designing version 2 of our platform, we had an epiphany, which was that the product is the trip. And what she meant by that is that people don't rent an Airbnb flat because they want to rent a flat. They rent it because they're trying to take a trip and they need a place to stay while they're on their trip.
Right.
And they started thinking about the larger context beyond just renting a flat. When you stay in a hotel, why are you there? Well, because you're taking your kids to Disneyland, or because you're making a sales call to a customer, or you're speaking at a conference. And so you need to do things like make a restaurant reservation or figure out how to get to the airport or what have you. And you need Wi-Fi to do that. So if all you think about is you are a user of my hotel, you use my room. So you want, clean sheets and hot water and, to be able to get into your room 24/7, you're missing part of the puzzle. And so when we think about people as humans and not just users, we think about what it is that they're trying to do. And I actually think that that's something that we need to build into how we do all of our work. So if you're an infrastructure team, you need to think about not just, well, I'm spinning up servers or provisioning databases, but what are these application teams trying to do with my stuff? What's their larger context? If you look at successful public cloud providers like Amazon Web Services, that's what they're all about. Right. And in my opinion, that's why they're the leaders of the market.
Yeah, it's not just because they're the cheapest, right?
Right.
Yeah, I actually end up coaching a lot of leaders around exactly what you're saying, because I think where they struggle is explaining that value on the other side of like what this person's job is, but I hear it all the time from the other side where I'm doing a lot of career coaching and people are saying, well, I want to leave this job because I don't feel the impact. I'm not feeling the impact of my work. I see that, my timesheet's getting done or the product's being shipped or whatever, but I'm not feeling that impact of the work. But then I have conversations with leaders on the other side and they're like, I need my team to feel the impact of their work. How do I get them to feel the impact of their work?
Right. And I think the way you do it is by organizing your work around the impact, which is one of the things I do is I teach something I call promise-driven design, which is basically simply about organizing all our work around the promises we make to our customers, whether they're internal or external. Could be a promise to security. It could be a promise to the application team. It could be a promise to business users or end customers. A promise is very simply a commitment to provide some level of benefit. So it does two things. One is when you think about why should we do continuous delivery or what should we deliver next? What is the promise? What is the benefit that we're providing? What is the purpose? What is the impact? The other piece is that the reason I use the word promise is because promises can get broken. And that forces us to think about the opportunity for failure, which forces us to think about how do we create a better opportunity for success by dealing with failure instead of ignoring it. And, if we go back to the conversation we had about people being afraid of losing their jobs or, losing their fiefdoms or whatever, I was at a DevOps conference a couple of years ago and somebody made what I thought was a very unfortunate comment when they said that DevOps does away with middle management. And luckily during the Q&A session, somebody raised their hand and said, well, I'm a middle manager and I'm not losing my job. And so I said, well, what is your job? And he gave the best answer. He said, my job is to foster communication. And the point is that when you look at these new structures, complex adaptive systems and microservice teams and all this good stuff, hierarchy doesn't go away, but it flips inside out. So your job as a manager, your job as a leader is no longer to make sure your team does its job properly. It's to make sure your team helps other teams do their jobs properly. And that success emerges from that. Where it used to be, well, we'll make this nice org chart. And so you're responsible for part A and I'm responsible for part B. And as long as you do your job and I do my job, the whole thing will work. now, we really need to flip it inside out.
Yeah. I mean, if it didn't sound so, cheap and startup-y, I mean, it's almost like, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think a lot of these managers' jobs are now ambassador jobs. Like their goal is to tie things in across systems and instead of just top down, get your timesheets done or, hit this date or whichever, right? Their goal is to make sure that the other teams and other silos and things, when I was in a director's position, I mean, it took me a while to figure that out, but eventually I did, is I figured out my job was not to manage my team. It was to manage the other leaders of the other groups and manage their expectations of what my team should be doing or should be doing better, should be doing, more of, and then what their teams need to do to provide my teams the things that are successful.
So my model is that everyone is a service provider now. And every part of the organization is a service provider to the other parts of the organization.
It's a great idea. I feel, though, that in certain organizations, like you had mentioned, they might struggle with that because we're so different. We have such different jobs. You're sales. Your job is to promise all these things that my product doesn't actually do. And then I'm back here trying to catch up to you, trying to figure out what the hell you're telling our clients and how now I can build that into my roadmap for the next year, right?
So maybe my job, if your job as a salesperson is to make promises, maybe my job is to help you make promises that we can successfully deliver on. But that simultaneously work from a sales perspective, which, if we can go a little bit further down the touchy-feely road, is about empathy, right? Is about empathizing with sales people. I had this fascinating interaction with a network engineer recently who was complaining about the marketing group that was publishing printed collateral that had links to domains that hadn't been registered yet. And he threw up his arms and he said, how can they not understand that? It's just common sense. And without thinking, I blurted out, well, obviously it's not common sense because they don't do it. Right. And the point is that maybe the network team needs to go and actually do some observation of the marketing team and understand, why aren't they doing it right? Air quotes here for people who can't see. Yep. And how do we help them do it right? So I think there's always an opportunity to sort of flip it.
Yeah.
Right? When you think about public cloud, it's the biggest silo in the history of IT. And supposedly we're getting rid of silos and supposedly we're insourcing now instead of outsourcing.
Yes.
But everybody's happy to outsource to the public cloud. Why is that? Because it works from a service perspective.
Right.
So I think that's the challenge for everyone.
No, that's a good point. And I like what you said about, going and I've said this before on the show, going and deploying empathy, like literally like thinking of it like you're pushing out something new if you have to, right? Is that if you haven't done it before, because I see people, I get into these conversations with folks and they're like, yeah, I don't know why that team is doing it that way over there. What the hell's wrong with them? And then they go about their business, but if you were to put pressure on them, I find there's two minds in there. One is like, well, I don't have the knowledge or the tooling to do what Jeff just said. I don't know how to approach that. I've never been taught how to go in there and do this without looking like I'm trying to be a know-it-all or I'm trying to be a busybody or I'm trying to, tell them what to do. Like, I don't know how to deploy that empathy in that way. Or on the other hand, they actually don't care enough and they're just complaining. You know what I mean?
Right.
And those are the people that drive me the most crazy. Because it's like, why are you even wasting the effort complaining if you don't care? Right? So, you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
But I think it's those people on the other side that don't have that skill set. And I don't mean they don't have that capability. I mean, like, they've never been taught how to go and be a part of that other group in a positive team sort of way.
Right. So teams that are at loggerheads with each other is something I encounter a lot. And what I do when I have the chance is to conduct a mutual listening and design exercise, which is to bring the two teams together and have them take turns talking about what they need, what isn't working, what's frustrating them, so on and so forth. And the other team is asked to just listen. Don't take notes. Don't ask questions. Don't interrupt. Just listen. And then they flip it. And then I have them jointly try and design a mutually satisfying solution to whatever the problem is. And often I find that something magical happens, which is instead of saying, this is what needs to change so it works for us, is people actually start to say, this is what we need to change so it works for you. So a lot of it is just getting people to listen and feel like they've been listened to with each other.
And I think that that's difficult for some people because, number one, they're like, I already have a job. Like, why do I need to go and spend time finding out how other people's jobs, what they do and all that other stuff, right?
Because that's part of your job now.
Yes, exactly. But
it didn't used to be.
Exactly. That's my point. Like it wasn't in the job description, right? That somebody didn't put in there, spend 10% of your time talking with other people about how they do their jobs. But I see people are doing that, but they learn it way too late, or or they do it after they're at their third job and they messed up in the first. You know what I mean? Because they learn through mistakes that's part of what it is. It's really understanding what actually makes your job successful, because it isn't just your silo. It's a whole team. There's a reason why all those other people are there. There's a reason why sales does what it does. I remember my first real interaction with sales in a negative way. It was all my fault because I didn't understand how they were incentivized.
Right.
I thought that I had assumed very wrongly, because I was dumb and immature, that they were incentivized like me, that they were incentivized to get this much amount done within a certain amount of time. But then when I found that their job was not only very different, obviously, because they did a different job, but that how they were incentivized to show up for work and how they were incentivized to communicate or not communicate or use things or don't use things was so different than what I had experienced, And I remember getting into arguments with my leader at the time saying, well, if you want us to work together, we should be incentivized to work together, but we're incentivized to completely do two different jobs. It almost was like there's two separate organizations in one place. Is that something you've experienced where when you talked about when?
Well, that's the classic DevOps conundrum.
Okay.
So I had a client. I went in, they wanted me to come in and help them do the DevOps. And one of the first things I found was the head of development was incented on time to market, and the head of operations was incented on uptime. And I said to the COO, until you align those, you won't have DevOps. That you really, and it would be an interesting thought experiment to flip them.
Oh, sure.
But they really should both be incented on both. So yes, they were, and this is classic Dev and Ops, is they have completely different purposes in life. And when you think about it, what do you pay a developer for? You don't pay a developer to sit at their desk and twiddle their thumbs. Right. You pay them to spit out chunks of code. In other words, to change stuff. Yeah. Right? How many lines of code did you write this week? How much change did you introduce? What do you pay ops for? Well, in a perfect world, ops has nothing to do. Right?
Because everything is running smoothly.
You pay them to get stuff back to the state where everything's okay.
It's exception management.
They're completely different universes. So when you do things like say, okay, developers get to carry the pager now, what you're doing is you're starting to align the incentives. When you give ops people tools that let them introduce change more continuously and more safely, you're starting to align the incentives.
That's a really good perspective. I think that I see that happening more on the design ops side too, where it's kind of getting that design thinking sort of approach into operations, but yet the designers thinking more from a business perspective, right? And aligning that, similar to what you're saying about like aligning those two different groups. I think that's fascinating. I mean, where do you see this going, right? So we talked a lot about change, and David Huston said Scrum is dead, and Agile, nobody likes to even say Agile anymore. It's become a 4-letter word, but it's not, it's 5. And the design thinking and DevOps and all these. What's next, Jeff? Like what's the next thing on the horizon that we got to pay attention to? What's coming? What's the new buzzword, or where do we actually need to go?
I think where we actually need to go is a fundamentally service-oriented approach. And I think we're living through, and I don't remember is it the trough of disillusionment with Agile and DevOps? Mm-hmm. I think people need what their promise is, and people have to figure out what that promise really is and how to really do it. And it doesn't really matter whether it's Scrum or XP or not Scrum and not XP. There's this hangover from the industrial age of, well, we're just pushing stuff out the factory door faster.
Yep.
And the ability to actually respond to change is what we really need. And I think people are stumbling their way towards that. Mm-hmm. So to be honest, maybe it's because I'm getting old. I feel like less and less of a visionary. I think maybe what we need to do next is to just figure out how to do what we're trying to do, quote unquote, properly. To do it from the perspective of having conversations with our customers, which is really what service is about.
Right.
So going from linear to circular, I think is an understanding, well, how does Agile help us do that? How does design help us do that? How does DevOps help us do that? Whatever we call it.
I feel like that's an important part, that people look to the tech or the framework side of things, and there's this whole soft sort of edges that don't get addressed. Like, you might go and get your Scrum certification, but can we add a layer of service training around that, like how to be a good customer service agent as part of those types of things, right?
Well, sure, that sounds great to me. I'd think about it on an even more basic level than that. You have your Scrum certification, but now I'm going to give you a test, assuming you can give a test for this, to see how well you could change Scrum in a particular environment, right? Here's the test here's a Scrum, and they're following all the rules, but something's broken. Figure out what it is and change your ceremonies in order to make it work, because that's what we really need, is people who can kind of design on their feet and not just implement the process they've been taught. Mm-hmm. And that, given our history, is really hard, because very few of us were educated to do that.
Yeah. Well, I find that was, and I went through a very similar aspect when my early days as a project manager and I always talked about it as this kind of curve that every project manager goes through. And I think a lot of other people do too. It's just from my experience, is this kind of curve of like, I'm in this thing, now I'm going to learn everything about it. I'm going to learn all the rules and I'm going to apply all the rules. And then at some point I find out that all the rules are kind of crap and they get in my way and they don't actually work, and they don't work in the environment that I'm in. And so now I have to systematically start breaking them apart. But there's an insecurity I have, because before I felt more secure that I had all these rules and certifications and things that I could lean on, things that where I was told, like, here's the standards, here's everything that's right to do. Mm-hmm. So I could lean on that and feel secure about myself and my position and who I was. But now on the tail side of it, now I'm kind of dismantling all of that. And I'm getting better at my job. It was weird, but then I would have to I almost had this like imposter syndrome sort of thing happening, where I was like, but I'm not doing the things that I was told is the way to do it, but I'm being more successful over here. What's wrong with me?
Yeah, and what I thought you were going to say, I thought you were going to do sort of a Zen Donovan thing. Of first there are rules, then there are no rules, then there are rules again. Right. Because the danger that I see is people do Scrum, and they have problems with it, and they throw it away.
Yep.
Scrum sucks, Scrum is dead, Scrum is evil, blah, 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 blah. Yep. Scrum is fine. There's nothing wrong with, I get into these arguments of, should you do fixed sprints or should you just do streaming development? Well, what I say is fixed sprints are very nice as a planning mechanism. That doesn't mean you can't deliver every day.
Yeah, right.
So is that not Scrum anymore? Well, I don't really care. So, one of the things I do as a consultant is I do not walk into organizations and say, well, you do Scrum. Scrum is terrible. We're going to get rid of it. What I say is, well, let's figure out what's wrong and let's fix it. And it's entirely possible that 6 months later, they might not be doing anything that looks like Scrum anymore, but I don't consider that a criterion for success for me. In my sort of more pessimistic moments, I sometimes think that we're not actually going to figure this stuff out until approximately 30 years after we change the educational system, because we need a generation to start from kindergarten and sort of learn how to continuously learn. And once those people enter the management level, then we'll really start to figure it out.
I like it. It's kind of utopian. I like that, Jeff. It's very positive future. See, and you said you're not your visionary.
Yeah.
I see it. It's right there. All right. Well, we're at time, so we're gonna wrap it up. Jeff, thank you so much. I learned so much. I always learn from our conversations. I appreciate you taking the time. So if I want to reach out to talk more or learn more about Jeff's ideas and maybe find out where Jeff's speaking next, or think, where are you most active? Where's a good place to find Jeff and learn more about it?
So you can find me on my website, sussna-associates.com. You can find me on Twitter or Medium at Jeff Sussna. And that's mainly it. Okay. And it's been a pleasure for me too. It's been a lot of fun. I love just this kind of talk as we go.
It's good.
Thank you for listening to The Schmidt List. If you want to learn more about how Foundry accelerates innovation, check out foundrymakes.com. And if you'd like me to speak about establishing a growth mindset at your conference or with your team, drop me a note at kurt@foundrymakes.com. Oh, and the next time you're on the internet, head to iTunes and leave the show a review. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, because sharing is caring. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to the show, and I hope you have a fantastic week.
I can't like a wrecking ball.